Foreword by the author. Dear listener, I'm at a loss for words, which is kind of difficult because this thing is all about words. It's about naming the feelings that accompany a story. The truth is, I never believed I would have the privilege to express the story of Mija Podcast in the literary world. For those of you who know me, bienvenidos familia. It's thanks to your listening and your love that we've been able to imagine the continuation of this Mija Podcast adventure in the audiobook format. For those of you who don't know me, a little introduction. My name is Lory, but my friends call me Mija. I am the daughter of Colombian immigrants, and I grew up in New York City in the 90s. As an adult, I immigrated from the United States to France to get a master's degree in 2015. It was in those early years that I really began to understand my parents' immigration experiences. That understanding inspired me to write an audio novela based on their immigration journey, telling the stories of their sorrows, their happiness, their triumphs, and their unrelenting hope for the future. The original podcast series I wrote was called Mija Podcast and contained 8 episodes with a bonus, each tracing the journey of a member of Mija's family. When Mija Podcast was released in 2019, it was published with the following description. Hosted by a narrator known only as Mija, my daughter in Spanish, each episode tells the story of how members of her family experience immigration. The original podcast reached number 1 in 31 countries. At the time, it was the first fiction podcast to be translated and distributed in several languages: English, French, and Spanish. Its worldwide success led to the continuation of the story of Mija through other immigrant daughters telling their stories from countries around the world. In the 4 years that followed, the podcast has been published in a total of 5 languages: English, Spanish, French, Mandarin, and Arabic. Its universality was a big part of its success. It's a story about bringing your roots to a new and strange place and trying to create a life there. And while the protagonist and narrator of this story shares her own family tree through these short audio vignettes, any girl with roots planted in a new country could take on the role of Mija. The original Mija was so titled because in Colombia, one uses the word mija to refer to women and girls of any age. It's a term of affection, of love, and comfort, meaning, among other things, you are my daughter, someone I want to protect and love, whether or not we are family. When my production team and I imagined adapting the podcast into an audiobook, we asked ourselves, what more could Mija tell? What more could we add to this story of cross-generational immigration? We realized that we had never told the behind the scenes of each person's journey, the truth of what inspired all these episodes. So out of those conversations about the inspiration, truths, and realities of immigration came this audiobook. In this first of its kind audio novella turned audiobook, you'll hear all of the original episodes of the series remastered for audiobook listening. And as a special bonus, after each one, you'll find bonus chapters telling the true story behind the fiction and how the real stories were transformed into a novella chapter by chapter. But first things first, behind the real Mija. Mija's story, as such, is a true story. Mostly. At its core, the original series is a fictional audio novella based on real events and real people, immigrants with dreams and goals. It's about those who love, those who've lost, and those who've suffered to try to succeed. Most of all, it's about those who live their lives with the unwavering belief that, no matter what happens, todo va a salir bien. Everything will turn out okay. As a writer, I gave myself certain liberties to tell the stories you're about to hear. Liberties that allowed me to imagine worlds and endings that illuminate the beautiful and the not-so-beautiful parts of the immigrant's life. For context, I wrote this story after a very particular experience. In 2018, I returned to New York for my brother's college graduation. Even though my mother had immigrated to the US from Colombia over 30 years prior, it was the first time my grandmother was approved for a visa that allowed her to come to the US. At the time, she was almost 85 years old and was accompanied by my aunt to spend a week with us in New York. It was one of the few times that my family was reunited far away from their home country of Colombia. We were all there, my mom, my dad, my grandmother, my aunts and uncles, those who lived in New York, and of course, my brother and me. Seeing them there together, having their coffee in the morning at the same table as if nothing had happened, as if the years and distance had never separated them, made me ask them questions I'd never thought to ask them before. Questions like, how was it when you first arrived? And how does it feel to finally see where your daughter has lived for so many years? Their answers shocked me. They had never considered their answers to be interesting to anyone. They didn't see how incredible their journey was to get here. So I began to imagine a documentary of a week with my immigrant family to celebrate their stories and show the world that they had a right to tell them too. I interviewed my mom, my dad, my grandmother, everyone. I was a radio journalist at the time, so it was natural for me to record and tell. But when I started writing and compiling all of their stories and anecdotes into actual scripts, I realized that I didn't want to go through the process of verifying dates and historical points. More than that, I couldn't imagine looking at my family's stories with the critical eye. These stories are their truths. We all have memories and stories that we tell ourselves. And what's important is not whether they're true or not. What's important is what it means to the person telling it and how the person hearing it feels. So in this novela, you are going to find exaggerations, magical realism, angels. But in the end, the one truth I want you to keep in mind as you listen is this. These are incredible stories about surviving and thriving as an immigrant. So here goes. Mija Podcast, the audiobook. I hope you like it. Sincerely, Lory Martinez, creator, producer, and the Mija of Mija Podcast.